Good afternoon, and welcome to our November ad hoc committee meeting. We are today working on our report. So that is our only agenda item. And just so that those joining us in person and online are aware, we are not going to have a formalized hearing of the public, but we do want to talk about the work that we're doing for our report in public. And so I am going to have everyone introduce themselves, even though we're not going to hear anybody speak. And then we'll start. So I'm Dr. Moffitt, Chair of the Ad Hoc Attendance Boundaries Committee. To my right,
Carolyn Jones, board member.
To my left,
Eve Bolton, board member.
Jeremy Gollihue, Chief Information Officer.
Carol Gibbs, Mount Auburn.
product of Cincinnati Public Schools.
Annie Coates, parent, LSDMC for PRM and Foundation at Clark.
Hi, I'm Ben Lindy, School Board President.
And even though we're not going to hear from the public, I do want to make sure that I say, because this is our last official meeting of the year, thank you to the community members who have been here for the past X number of months, enduring this with us and engaging. So thank you so much for joining us and sticking with us.
Yeah.
So let's get to the crust of, and we are going to be losing one of our committee members for the day, not yet. She's still on the countdown, but she's going to have to leave this meeting early. And then President Lindy is also going to have to leave the meeting early. So, and we are going to have a hard stop at 5:30, but let's kind of get into the meat of it. Board Member Jones has provided us with a summation of her thoughts. Do you all want to go through that now? How do you want to start? Yes, ma'am.
If I could just take a few minutes, just do a broad overview
Okay.
of how I came to this,
Okay,
and then we can plug in some things. Or, yeah.
that's fine.
Okay, so I think as the last time we met, we added a lot. We talked about some things and trying to make sure that we covered everything. One of the things when I went home, and over several days, was trying to put something together that at least made sense about what we're doing here. It was clear to me that there was a lot of information. We have a lot of information. We have a lot of data and all that. So putting it all together was kind of hard. So we had to come up with some sort of framework for how we organize the stuff. So the framework that you have in front of you is a really, really rough draft skeletal that sort of outlines by section what we want to cover, and then I put bullet points in there that would describe some of the pieces of information that we talked about needed to go in a particular section, so they correspond. I made sure that I added the comments that board members have made. I did not change I didn't change, for the most part, most of the consensus points. I left all those in there. Where there was redundancy, I did change that. So some of that, because there was a lot of repetition in there. So if I could go through it, basically the outline for the report is 4 sections, possibly 3, but I'll talk about that. The first section is the executive summary and would include the purpose, the historical context, the district vision, mission, goals, guardrails, and forecast, and the findings. And again, if you look at it, you'll see bullet points under there, and that's information that I pulled from a lot of sources. It can be changed, it can be narrowed down, it can be prioritized however we want. So that goes in the first section. And if you look in the findings, you will know, because I know Ms. Bolton was asking, there are 18 findings. in there. And those are the things that we need it to go back on and see if it is truly a finding, then how are we substantiating that? So we need data attached to that. The second category are the recommendations. And I took the liberty of just writing out 4, 5 broad recommendations, which you see in red. They are very broad. The actual crux of this is in the language of the consensus points. And there are a lot of consensus points. And the only thing that I changed was I tried to reduce the redundancy. I did not change the text of the consensus points. So those need to have some more work done to those. So, but we do need to have a conversation around these 5 recommendations if it truly speaks to what we're trying to do. And if it doesn't, that's fine. I'm fine with that. So then the third section is the summary. I call it summary / closing next steps. And it could probably be just next steps. What do we want from this report? What are our next stages or next steps to delivering the product or movement or whatever? So we need to look at that. And then the fourth category is appendix. At our last meeting, Board Member Bolton suggested we attach the appendix. My suggestion would be to hyperlink as much of the information as possible to reduce the number of pages that people have to look at. So that's it. That's just the framework for it. But again, I took a shot at it, trying to bring some fluidity to it, but we can go back and talk about if this makes sense or what needs to happen. So
I think this looks good, and just to be completely honest, this is the first time I saw it. We did have a great conversation.
yes.
So this is the first time that we're seeing this together. We did have a great meeting last week where we kind of came to these particular sections. And my only suggestion, and as I shared with you yesterday, is to put the recommendations first, because I think that we are limited with time, and I did speak to President Lindy that we may be able to get an adjustment on the date, but because we are limited with time, what are our recommendations, and then why after that? But yes, ma'am, go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, I'm happy with the structure. I think that, you know, as the 3 of us together might put more flesh somewhere on one thing than another or whatever, that I like the structure. I would suggest, though, based upon the kinds of things we're talking about, I do think that there should be somewhere in this, and part of one section should be where we foresee no change. Because
It's in there.
okay, but I'm
It's
just
in
saying
here.
to really emphasize where there would be no change, and almost, I know we try to resist that from almost to which schools there would be no change.
It's in here.
Yeah,
Rob, if
I got you.
If you go down to number 17, Rob, that is listed there.
But I mean, I would make that a chapter. I wouldn't,
Oh,
that's what I'm saying, as a section. The 2 other things I would add as a section. Carolyn, you and I might as well go out the same way we came in. I'm trying to add something and you're trying to edit something, so we're a great
We've been
team.
doing this since 2016.
Every bit of
And they've been putting me in the middle now for
Every
2
bit of it.
years.
So, but I would also add a section that is cost. Because I think the board will reject, or certainly the administration will reject, and the community will reject, because we've been making some case that somehow this is going to help us, avoid the cliff and whatever.
Can I add something to what you're saying? We don't know the cost.
No, but we know the questions to ask of the cost. Maybe that's like, that's what I think we would be able to say by doing this or that, or by drawing the lines on the west side of the district. What does that, we know some questions to ask that could lead us to cost, lead the administration to
Okay.
cost. And then the other thing that I do think I want to try to put in, if we can, is it something that has come up at least in every other meeting? And it's from the community folks as much as it's been from us. And it's about the messaging / the marketing. How hard it is to market this district in its current arrangement. You know, the perception that we're magnet or we're neighborhood, and that it's a dual system. Or people can't understand that if they don't do a Montessori at the beginning, then they might not be able to have the Montessori choice later. So I'm not sure what that section looks like, but I think the messaging of this for the future of the district is important, and to the future, to the degree that this is going to be successful or well received or poorly received. I think messaging and marketing and explaining how it'll change the perception of the district, I think would be added. But I think I like the recommend. I mean, I like whatever, you know, as you've listed, and all the work that the chair's done, the committee's done to put everything together in the administration.
Okay, so if I could comment on
Yeah.
that, we can word it any way, and I get what you're saying about the messaging and the marketing piece. It was written as a consensus point, which is why it didn't have the broadness of it. So what you're suggesting is that it be a little more broader.
Yeah.
And I know that the committee put a lot of emphasis on marketing, messaging, and community engagement. So you're saying that's a higher priority, so it kind of needs its own space.
Yes.
Okay.
I would think that that needs to be under recommendations. We heard that from the community. We heard that from individual schools within the community, but overarchingly, I think across every corridor, everyone was complaining about the messaging and marketing of either their schools or the system and how to navigate the system of schools. So I think that that's strong enough to be a serious recommendation that marketing be looked at and or adjusted. Marketing messaging. What else were you gonna say?
I'm good with that. However we want to do it, I just think it needs to be a big emphasis. I just need to be clear about what the recommendations are. I'm anticipating that the recommendations are what the committee is recommending to the board be done.
I think they're in red. Yes, let's do that. Because
I mean, is that how we're just defining recommendation? I'm not unclear about what ones we might be recommending, might add or take away. I'm just saying a recommendation from a committee is a recommendation to the board that this occur.
That's how I look at it.
Okay, but I'm just saying that you just said like it could be the marketing thing is a recommendation from the community. That's the background on it, but a recommendation is what we're taking to the board.
Okay, so let's start with recommendation. I'm sorry, Chair.
it's okay. I'm used to it. I got two mamas up here. Good gracious.
So let's look at recommendations on the second
You,
page.
see, you don't have the page numbers. We gotta have the page
I'm
numbers. We gotta have the page
sorry.
numbers. So page 1,
Okay.
2, page
That's
3.
all right. I
The
told
first
everybody I
one.
knew you had COVID because I read the text wrong.
So page 3, Rob.
Okay, is it page 3?
Did you send this? Did you send this to all of us?
You know how
I
the
did.
Electronically?
Everybody.
Okay.
So here's the first recommendation, and it's
6
broad.
months ago.
It's
Okay.
broad. So let's say the first recommendation, redesign system of schools within 3 geographic corridors aligned to neighborhood boundaries based on capacity, enrollment, and attendance. And then I suggest a hyperlink the corridor designations and the enrollment capacity data. So that's the first recommendation.
Yes, ma'am.
I would, based upon the superintendent of the administration's audit, I would have programming.
Mm-hmm.
What programming is the second recommendation?
Okay, but I mean, but your 3 corridors have
Redesign
something to
it.
do with programming.
It's a
The-
separate recommendation.
It can't, well, we'll get to that, but I'm just saying, we're not suggesting the corridors only because of the things that were just mentioned, but we were trying to make sure that similar programming was in each of the
Okay,
corridors.
but can I read the recommendations
Sure,
first?
go ahead.
Okay.
Okay, I want to
That's
get
the
through them all
first.
before we wrap. Okay,
I'm-
that's fine.
That's the first recommendation. The second recommendation is, and I'm open to change. Analyze and strengthen program focus to achieve equitable accessibility within each corridor.
Your editor would say to you that fits in the first one.
I was gonna say, I think unless you're gonna have a section on equity, that when you say redesign the system of schools, isn't programming considered a system of schools?
When I did the redesign of the schools, I was thinking structurally, buildings.
Yeah.
Got it.
I wasn't thinking programming.
Okay. Next.
Okay, the third recommendation, create improved ease of access that provides transportation within each corridor, resulting in reduced transportation costs across the district. That is strictly transportation. Fourth recommendation, establish a system continuum across all corridors that allow for creation of middle schools, grades 6 through 8. And then the fifth recommendation, reevaluate policy procedures regarding high schools of choice.
Okay. So, were you done?
I'm done.
Okay.
Those are 5 recommendations.
So we also had more recommendations. So we have specifically to update the boundary lines for North Central. We is it in there?
It's
okay. It's underneath
consistent.
number 1. Okay. You just direct me to where it is. We have update on the east side without touching PRM as a neighborhood school. Blah 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 blah. Is that in the consensus too?
Everything that we suggested that references the redesign of schools based on the corridors is under
Is in
that
there.
particular recommendation.
Okay.
I didn't change a thing.
What about adding a K through 12 in the central corridor? That's in there? Because that was kind of a consensus thing that we have. I see it under number 2. There is not a K through 12 in the central. And then overcrowding of the West Side elementaries. Where's that part at?
All of it's in there.
Okay. Okay. I got it. I see it. Yes, ma'am.
So every one of the consensus items, and we have agreement about many of those or all of those, and there might be others that somehow come to us as we figure this all out, fit within those 5 recommendations.
Yes. And everything, I went back through every single minute.
Oh, I trust you totally on it. I'm just saying.
It just needs to be worded and cleaned up.
So what I would say is that then I do think that within those themes or whatever we're recommendations, general recommendations, we might need a 6th or a 7th recommendation or a 5th, rather than the 5. I don't know what they would be, but
Well,
to
messaging.
fit everything.
Messaging.
Yeah, messaging, community engagement or something, would be
Now,
one, and then the cost.
the cost, you want that as an appendix?
I think the cost is one of the recommendations, that these things can't be prohibitive. And yet, I mean, how are we going to say that this is good dollars to spend? What are we looking to create?
That's the piece that I thought was missing.
Yeah.
The justification for it. I thought that.
Yeah.
And maybe
I
that can be a form of one of the general recommendations.
But I think that should be under each theme of the recommendation. The reason why we're recommending it should have some sort of cost analysis to it.
Each recommendation.
Each recommendation.
Each recommendation could have the cost analysis, but again, the theme of, we are trying to make the district sustainable financially. And we're obviously trying to grow the district as well. I mean, even now the treasurer is talking about growth in the district, which is sort of a different perspective from her than in the past so much. So there's growth and there's sustainability. There is, maybe if we could kind of figure what we're looking for overall, not the return on investment only, but
what you just said to me is part of the purpose of why we're doing all of it.
oh, absolutely.
So it can go at the top.
In the executive
when we're
summary.
talking about when we're introducing it, that is
No
justifies
question.
why we we're doing.
I agree. I do also, with respect to the conversation that I had with the treasurer today, want us to be directed on your number 5, which is reevaluate policy procedures regarding high schools of choice. To me, and I said this before, I think that drives a lot of all of this. But that's just, I almost would make that number 1. If I were a board member listening to all this, I would like to have all of the information, the historical perspective. I want to have the cost analysis. I don't want to have to be like, okay, you guys spent all this time and I still have a lot of questions. I think that was our job, to get to the answers, to give them all of the data, or at least to collect all the information to get the data for the board. So that's why I think every one of these recommendations needs to have an example of a potential cost savings or some sort of cost comparison. And as Jen said, a differential cost, so that we can know what the impact would be to the district. That's just me.
I don't disagree, but I'm kind of thinking in terms of, this is what we just are talking about now is almost the executive summary of the report, more than this is the report. I think the report is what you're talking about, that substantiates everything. Here's the hyperlinks. Here's the minutes when we said this and whatever. That's the report. But this, I think Carolyn's outline here is the executive summary. This is what the board's going to read. Then they can have the report that helps them understand, oh, I'll look up those minutes, or I can see those minutes. We can't walk in there with only an executive summary, but we can't also not walk in there without an executive summary for people to concentrate, because it's just so huge.
Yeah, it is huge. And in my thinking about that, the executive summary is just a small piece of this. If the executive summary just is a brief overview.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and I'll tell you, those recommendations are part of the executive summary.
Well, she has them separate. She has them like executive summary is just the purpose, the historical context, which, to be honest with you, is greater than just this little piece. We've spent months talking about how we got from the Meridian plan to the corridor model. And so that's not captured in here at all. And that's the one part that's missing.
Yeah, and see, to me, it's important to know that student achievement and policy began working on this in 2017. And the Meridian plan impacted this. And I think board members need to know that. It doesn't have to be extensive, but they need to know as reference points. You can hyperlink to some of that information. And so I don't think it would take a lot to do that. I do agree with Ms. Bolton and Chair Moffitt around the cost analysis being attached to each recommendation. What does that look like? And that's going to require a lot more details with the data and things that we haven't done. So to be as specific as possible about what's needed in each one of those recommendations, I think is incumbent on us. We need to know exactly what do we need to do this cost analysis, or if that makes sense.
Well, to that point,
Sorry, just an FYI, Jen is on.
Oh, okay, we'll bring
as well.
Okay.
Okay.
Well, she tell her, yeah, Jen can join the meeting. I don't want to talk around her. If you could bring her up so that she can join us. Just to your point, because you said this, and I want to make sure I captured that you said this on the record. In order for us to give a recommendation of middle schools, we have to give an example so that Jeremy can pull the numbers and Jen can run a cost analysis. We can't just talk about, oh, well, hey, form middle schools. We spoke specifically around examples of middle schools and what that would look like from the capacity standpoint. Correct me if I'm wrong, Jeremy. From a capacity standpoint, we talked about the central and the east corridor potentially, but there was nothing available on the west corridor, which is kind of where before we went down the rabbit hole. And in order for us to get some semblance of cost, we have to give specifics.
Okay.
Namely, and Jan, correct me if I'm wrong, we have to give, in order for you to create a differential cost, We have to give you the schools involved, potentially the grade levels, and the teacher formula is based on grade levels. Is that right?
That's correct.
Okay, so we have to, and I know you talked about that getting into the weeds, but we have to give an example for the board to see what we're talking about regarding some of these recommendations. Now, that doesn't have to be, and I think where you and we agree on that, but we are not saying go do that, but we're saying as an example, this is what could happen. And I just think we have to be representative of the work that we put in for months around Jeremy's work on maps and capacity. Do you disagree?
I don't disagree. I don't know if we can do all that by the 4th.
No, we can't.
Jen, can you and Jeremy give us some input? Could you give us
That's what I said.
like high level potential cost savings? Both of you, I mean, we're just asking
Or
for-
additional costs, let's be real. We
Yeah.
have no idea if this is really gonna be such a savings. I mean,
And part of what we're struggling with, we had lots of conversations about what we want, what the committee wanted around is to create middle schools, but we didn't talk in great detail about what it would look like in each corridor or what schools affected.
We did talk about that. That's how we got Silverton coming to the meetings and John P. Parker coming to the meetings, because we just said, but we did find that there wasn't a possibility on the West. Correct me. There wasn't a possibility for a middle school with regard to capacity on the West, but that there was potential middle school options in the Central. There was potential middle school options on the East. We got there. We didn't have the numbers because we got to even schools, but we didn't have the numbers because where we stopped was that the superintendent wanted K through 8s. At one point, we had that conversation, and then we had we wanted K through 6, and we got there though.
May I ask a few questions?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, so I am, Rob sent me the document you guys were reviewing and I quickly skimmed it for understanding. If I capture this correctly, we want 3 corridors. We would prefer to have a middle school in each corridor and a K-12 in each corridor. Is that correct? And Montessori options in each corridor.
Yes, ma'am. Go ahead.
at least that, but it also speaks to international schools and assortment of preschools yeah, so it'd be equitable access in each of the 3 quarters for all the programs.
So
IB.
I'm thinking those rules as guardrails for the administration to go and do the design, right? I did play with the scenario this afternoon that Dr. Moffitt shared with me, and it was the Woodward, Hughes, Withrow 912s. South Avondale is a 678, and Rockdale is a PK to 5. Sorry, PK to 5. But as you play with the numbers, there are so many kids in those buildings that live outside the corridor. They're not part of those corridor schools. We have to decide what to do with them. So if they're in the corridor, they would go to South Avondale as 6th, 7th, and 8th graders. But if they're going to be 6th, 7th, and 8th graders next year and they don't live in the corridor, where do they go?
Yeah, that's
So
what
that's
one.
That was the first one. And that's why Jen and I got back to high schools of choice, because that seemed to be the question that we needed to answer, or schools of choice, because it seemed as if we needed to answer that question kind of parallel to the corridor model, and then the navigation of students. Yes, ma'am.
I would, again, I caution about the high schools of choice. Obviously, we have to move away from all of our high schools being high schools of choice. We've known that for more than 6 years, frankly, with transportation and whatever. But that was somewhat mitigated by the fact that we had Metro instead of having the extra routes and what have you. But again, I in the marketing and the messaging, it would seem to be that there probably are still going to be different. Some high schools won't be the 912, which is what we want. And you listed the ones that perhaps would be some of the ones that we could suggest. But on to the middle school piece, it's possible we said the first meeting that this is going to take 2 to 3 years of grandfathering people too.
And that's a good point to make.
And we've said that from the get-go because it too much to ask people for some immediate change. Even we've had somewhat transitioning of whether it's Woodford or whether it's Silverton or whatever. It's all, the superintendent was smart. She built it around who gets the additional transportation and who doesn't. That's sort of the way that she approached it initially when these things were first presented. The other thing is I would like, and while Carolyn is still with us here, and not jumping on Jen's thing right now, but I do think that if you, on the west side, if you might, since we have to redraw those lines anyway, somewhere more conducive to whatever those neighborhoods are on the west side. And they've made more neighborhoods on the west side recently than there has been historically. And we won't tell you why the city's done that. But you might have to move a Mount Airy into the west to get better neighborhood opportunity, as well as you might have to get rid of LEAP as a STEM, isn't it? It's not a neighborhood.
LEAP is a international language.
Internet, but that's a magnet.
Correct.
That's a magnet. But it's one of those schools that's on the west side, but we can't do that to Roberts because of its size. But I'm saying you might be able to work out a middle school on the west side. I doubt it, but you might be able to work out if we redo the lines and we include maybe someplace like a Mount Airy, and Mount Airy stops taking College Hill kids and so all of that. So you might even be able to address it on the west side, but as generally, you're asking about a specific example so that at least the modeling could take place?
Well, I'm trying to get everyone to think through some of the data so that you know what guardrails to put in place. Like, for example, back when we were doing the FMP and redistricting boundaries, we had a balance for race and gender. And which is why we came up with all those weird boundaries, right? So if that's one of the guardrails that says, you know, one of the other rules around redistricting is you couldn't cross over 71 or 75, you know, that kind of thing.
I got you.
So,
I see what you mean. I remember that.
I'm glad to hear that you're considering a short-term grandfathering, because in the past, when we've grandfathered, it applied to siblings and then unborn siblings, and that just
We're still doing that, I think.
Yes.
I couldn't answer that question for Jen earlier, so I'm glad that we got the historical perspective.
So I had kind of a misunderstanding of the specificity of what this report that you all were coming up with. I thought it was going to be much more specifically driven. So if you move forward and if this plan gets adopted by the board by December 4th, what kind of time frame are you looking to get the administration's plan back?
A very good question. To be honest with you, Jen, I'm going to include my committee members. I don't think that December 4th will result in any sort of decision making, because quite frankly, I think it's a lot of information. They're going to come back with more questions. In 1 hour, there's no way that all of this could be outlined. We still have questions for you, and we sit here with you once a month for an hour and a half. So I think that the board is going to be able to get this information. They're going to have questions. We're going to have to dissect it, massage it. The community is also going to hear it at the same time. That's going to generate a whole slew of questions.
Right.
And I think that we've got some of administration's input, but that's going to also generate some questions. So I think this is well into January that we are kind of finalizing and answering the specifics to make the recommendations along with the budget conversation. That's just me. Tell me if you think I'm off base on that. I just think January is going to be it. What do you think? I know you can come back. You can come back and visit.
I'm not disagreeing. about that. I do think it needs a great deal more specificity. The thing today, this today was a framework for that.
Mark the
But
date.
if you were to go
Taking a
back and
picture.
look at it, I'm not the one to write the report. I can tell you that.
I know. I'm gonna
Because-
write it. I'm gonna write it.
Because I write mine, the way I think about it is broad scope, but it has a level of specificity that could get us to where we're going. Like when Eve is talking about this stuff, she hasn't worked out in her brain, well, this school should be here and there and there. That makes absolutely no sense to me. I respect what she says and I understand it. And if that's the level of specificity that we need to do, then we need to do it. But I don't think
Well,
it's going to be ready. It's not going to be ready for December 4th with that level of specificity and it has to include some type of cost analysis. That's just my opinion.
But I do think that, oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I think some sort of executive summary is
Mhm.
available for people to even start to process it. They know we've
Yes.
been doing this. And I think that the broad strokes, you'd almost get the board to say, yeah. I mean, this is not coming out of nowhere. People have been worried about the cost of high schools of choice. That's been out there. We know that the West Side's been totally overdrawn, so to speak, and we've talked about building capacity. So I think on December 4th, a broad stroke with the substantiation from the report itself, you would at least get a sense of whether the three of us are totally crazy, or indeed if it's going to be, there's a common commitment to making this re-envisioning.
So how about we explore this option before you go? Maybe on December 4th, we have an hour budgeted, right, Ben? Okay, but I'm just thinking maybe what we would do is just give our high level
Mhm.
explanation and the historical context, because and kind of like the setup, because the historical context is so much, but I think it's super important for everyone to have. Maybe we just take our hour and we come up with the whole year that it took us to come up with the historical context and why we did what we did and where we are now. Then the next meeting, or whenever we get another opportunity, we can take an hour to come up with why we're talking about what we're talking about, like what our recommendations are and why we're talking.
I would
here.
do it in reverse.
Oh, okay.
Oh, Ben.
No, I was going to say, I think that the mobility committee were once, I think you all have done an enormous amount of work. I want to make sure we have time for people to fully engage with that. The other thing I think is true is unless there's a deadline, things will just keep going forever.
Right.
And so I think given how long the committee's been working, I think it's really important that we get the final recommendation out in December, rather than kicking it into next year.
Okay, well then we can switch it. I think you just said that. Let's just switch it then. Let's come up with it. Well, see, the only reason why I'm hesitant for recommendations is because the recommendations, to fully do them justice, is going to require a cost analysis. And we're not going to be able to get that. But or do you think, Jeremy?
I just wanted to ask a question just for some real clarity. That I guess part of my confusion from an administration standpoint is when we're talking about recommendations going to the board, how are we viewing the outcome of those recommendations for administration? So are we looking at, these are kind of to what Jen referenced, we want 3 or 4 things, these are the guardrails, these are the recommendations that the administration now takes offline and builds a plan to come back and say, here's how we think we might do this? Or are we looking at the outcome of the recommendations to be, we want school X to be Y, we want school A to be 3? Like, what? I'm not real clear on which outcome we're targeting for the recommendations for what our next steps would be,
Okay.
if that's fair.
Very, very. Go ahead.
I think it's much more modeled on the FMP than it is modeled on regular committee work, which is that through the community, through the board, through the need to pass levies or whatever, indeed, the board kind of came up with these are some of the things, like we want community learning centers, or and here's this, you all would tell us which schools were the worst, right, Jen, and the things that we couldn't save, or how many schools in east or west, which facilities could be saved, which facilities needed to be jettisoned. So I think it's, we're not going to say, we want these 5 things and you go figure it out. Let me tell you, that ain't going to happen. Okay?
Right.
That ain't going to happen. What's going to happen is coming together, and I think there is going to be specificity to this, where I think we'll give you some ideas and stuff, or is what we want. Not everything, obviously, because some of the stuff's going to work and some of it isn't going to work. So I think you're going to get much more, you're going to get a more, see you, kid. Is this their last committee meeting? Bye. I am short.
Ms.
So-
Bolton,
Yes.
I'm sorry to interrupt you, but I also have to leave at 5 because I have a standing commitment on Thursday evenings. But I can't cost things out until I understand the specifics. So I just want to set expectations that we can't put costs in the report that you're going to have on the 4th.
It's not going to happen.
That's what I was saying, which is the reason why I said we should not do. I would much rather not talk about something that we have to come back and revisit and we can't give it in totality than to talk about it and it's done and then they have what they need. Because it has been our pattern, I don't know who, but once we present something, we say something, things get misconstrued and then it gets turned around. I just think we need to provide the board with every bit of information that we can at the first time so that they're not getting half of it and then somebody comes in, a survey gets sent out and we're being twisted all around in Mulberry Bush.
You and I we just have a majority now. I agree with you. Okay?
I'm sorry.
So Ben's gone, Carolyn's gone. I agree with you. But here's the thing. This board is not going to be able to absorb any more than the recommendations in the executive summary. And that's several pages. And there's big stuff. Okay? But I do think on December 4th, they should have a draft of the greater, more specified report itself as to how we got. We're not going to have time to present the whole report. We'll barely have enough time, and he's going to give us more than an hour because we're not going to shut up. So he'll say, okay, we'll just keep talking. So, I mean, it all works out. And so I think that get people's brains around these big things.
Okay.
And give them the next weeks or two or the holidays to look at some of the specificity with the how we got here, it's the history. I mean, Mike's going to remember, hell, we proposed several of these things 5 years ago and they didn't get done. So, I mean, they're going to have that kind of support. So I think we do it all, but the presentation is the recommendations, the findings, the skeletal version, but they get a draft of a report and they get enough of some specificity as to, what kinds of costs are we talking? What would cost us more? You don't have to tell us how much, but what would cost us less? How do we save money by consolidating schools? Where's the consolidation savings? Is that administration? Is that support staff? Is that one less building operating? Is it transportation? Do you tell us how we can save money and what will cost us more money? I don't know that we can staff based upon how the state of Ohio licenses people anymore. I don't even know if we could staff middle schools, but we want to.
Well, that's what Jen was sharing that she needed. Because that's the one piece with regard to staff, but then there's also the piece that you've got. Jen, you can help me. When we talked earlier today, you've got fifth graders who would be, if we had a middle school option, fifth graders who, if we were to use the Rockdale South Avondale, they would be going to a different building. They could potentially be going to a different building, and then some of those kids that are in high schools, the current 6th and 7th graders that would be 7th and 8th graders would be going back to potentially their elementary, you know, there's that piece. Jen, you explained it much better than me.
Right, so it's the current 7th graders in a 7-12 building who will be 8th
Mhm.
graders next year, going back to a non-high school building.
That's right.
Sorry, I'm a sneeze. But to answer your question about big costs,
God bless you.
Gracious.
sorry. If you close a building and don't reuse it for something, you can save money. Consolidating schools, it depends on the configuration and the staffing formulas that apply, right? So like for this example that we're talking about, will the 6th, 7th, and 8th grade building have counselors in it?
Yeah, I think that's something administration would have to work on. If it doesn't,
Right.
you know, and I told Jen, that would be an Ironetta
K6s
question.
don't.
But 6, 7,
K6s
8.
don't,
would we
but the
give them
K8s
count-
do.
7th and 8th do, based upon them being not, being in high schools.
Right.
And they would need a lot.
Well, they need
So
to
that
not be
might,
in high
that might
schools.
actually cost more money because you're
Exactly.
spreading counselors across more buildings. Transportation depends on what policies that you put in place. Like we were
Mhm.
talking earlier, if you live outside the corridor, then you pay for your own transportation. So it's like I said, that's why we need to understand what the guardrails are so that we can then go tell you what
Yeah.
that costs.
Those are
And
the
then you can change
questions.
the guardrail if you want to.
Yeah,
Okay, so we need to, as a committee, I'm writing this down. Committee needs to give administration and the treasurer what the guardrails would be for reconfiguring
Right.
a middle school
It's like-
option.
Yeah, like the shalt nots, right? What don't you want us to break? And let us get creative with it.
Okay,
well, I get worried when you all get creative, but,
I trust you.
Especially a financial person, right?
Yeah, enough trust to let you do that. Sure.
Putting my old SIS hat on.
Yes,
But so then
exactly.
maybe what Chris and Derek and Jeremy and I can get our heads together and come up with a list of things that present a list of questions that we need answered. Maybe that'll help too.
That would help.
That would help a lot.
What guardrails can you think of? Because I can put it in the report that we can have on our on our second set of, on our second meeting. We've given you the guardrails. These are the potentials.
Okay, so like you already mentioned one that you would be because when you and I talked earlier, you were saying no grandfathering, but 2 to 3 year max. I don't know.
Mhm.
So
Yeah, I'm not big on grandfathering, but my colleagues are, so that's fine.
It's
I just
only
think you
fair to
just
families.
hit it. Well, yeah, I guess so.
but you don't want to send people outside the district that they get angry because
Exactly.
we're losing. Right?
We're trying to grow, not. Here's
Um,
on the coming up with questions. I think, Madam Chair, if we concentrate on this skeletal thing,
Okay.
period, and we hand over to the administration sometime next week or whatever with this in draft form. Because, you know, where we've put everything under each of these 5 or we've added, that is going to give them enough understanding, I think, for them to come up with the question. Even if they don't see this, they can come up with questions. I mean, Jeremy's
Right.
been coming up with questions every meeting. Well, does that mean this? Does that mean, like, I have a question. If we added 2 more buildings to the west side, does that help? Because we have to redraw those lines. And that's not a cost thing. That's a thing that has to be done in order to have the overcrowding be taken care of. Or
So-
how much do you save by not having, make sure you got your seatbelt on. How much do we save if we have Taft Elementary not be a magnet or College Hill Fundamental not being a magnet?
Oh, you'll save money for that if they go to
Yeah.
neighborhood buildings. Yeah. So what's the thought on what busing service will the 6, 7, and 8 building get? Yellow or Metro?
Metro or yellow.
Hold on 1 second. Give me a second. I'm writing these down. What did you just say? You said how much savings would
How
there
many
be?
savings, yeah, we can come up, how much savings if we make Taft Elementary a neighborhood rather than a magnet, or College Hill Fundamental, rather than a magnet, make it a neighborhood?
Can I add a sub question?
Yes, ma'am.
Would be, what would we do with the kids? Neither of those, let me rephrase that. At least Cully Chill does not currently have an attendance boundary. So if we were to create a neighborhood, we would have to create a boundary within the boundary that currently exists.
Mhm.
So the kids who live within that boundary would no longer go to their, after a grandfather period. The intent would be for those kids to no longer go to the current school, but to the new neighborhood school.
Well, yeah, because you could make College Hill Fundamental the primary building, and you could make Pleasant Hill the middle school grades or whatever.
And you could do Rothenberg.
And well,
God
you could
bless
do
you.
Rothenberg and Hayes that way too. There's lots of
Right.
things we can do.
Well, they can work on that. That's the part that I think you all could work on.
Right.
Okay.
So the
But-
last question, Dr. Masha, was,
Yes, ma'am.
the last question, I don't know if you captured that, was the 7, 6, 7, 8 buildings, would they be yellow bus or Metro?
We won't, in all likelihood, we won't put sixth graders on Metro. People don't even like seventh or eighth graders on Metro, but that would be so cost prohibitive to have all the seventh and eighth graders be on Yellow Bus. But we're also presuming that Metro is going to be Metro and not service very well for the rest of our lives, which I don't think is going to happen.
Well, that's also that, you know, I was going to say that that's the reason why I came right back to we need to talk about schools of choice. Because if you were to put them in the corridor model and make make them neighborhood schools, then you have a neighborhood school in your middle school. You have a middle school in your neighborhood. And in theory, you need to be walking there, in theory. I know
That's the
Jeremy's going to kill me
idea.
like, well, you got some kids that come. But to me, that's more impactful to the changes that we're talking about, to have that discussion to say, I also would love to see, Jen, what does it look like if we were to remove the schools of choice option with that, or just have magnet versus magnet neighborhoods? Because, is that right? Am I saying that right? No. Okay,
Magnet
hold on.
neighborhoods, no.
If we were to remove schools of choice, what does that look like for the district? Because that's
You're
actually
talking
one
about
of my,
high schools or all schools of choice?
well, I think we could get the data on both, if you want my honest opinion. Is that too cumbersome to do both?
Here's the marketing and messaging piece of this for everybody. We cannot, after we've spent 20 years trying to keep, very frankly, people in the district, especially middle-class folks, by offering them choice. All of a sudden to wake up one morning and say choice is not our first option any longer. There has to be a reasonable mix to all of this for folks. People have to be able to see the systems as choices. There has to be choice within each corridor. You can't.
Okay,
You can't.
that's a guardrail.
Okay, I'm writing it down.
And it has to be programmatic choice. There has to be, and it won't be that we have 3 of everything. We can't probably afford it.
Right.
But there will be, you're still going to have some district-wide magnets, like we're not going to get rid of Fairview. You know, you're going to have a west and a west and east and a central for Montessori, but you might only have a west and an east, like Laura wanted to have for IB. I mean, that was part of the plan, to putting in IB. So there's still that kind of confusion. But to Carol's point, the idea is to get it to where people see their neighborhood. Let's be real. People leave this district rather than send their 7th and 8th grade children to high schools.
It's true. But again, that goes back to marketing.
Yes, the messaging. We have
What
to.
data do we have that supports that?
Huh?
Our enrollment, I don't know what they're, well, that's a good question, Jeremy.
Jeremy, have we done a data analysis on that?
I missed the question. Can we repeat it?
That kids leave after 6th grade instead of sending their kids to junior high and high school. We have a dip in enrollment. Is there data to show that after 6th grade?
So I haven't done an analysis in deep enough that I would be comfortable saying there is evidence of that for sure.
Yes, do
What
it.
I can say is that and I'm comfortable saying, is that there is evidence that as grades progress, we lose kids continuously.
Okay.
So starting as low as from first, second grade, all the way through high school, every grade continually decreases in size.
We have some K-8 buildings like Hartwell or Sailor Park, largely because it's the recognition that people won't go to the high schools that they would be sent to. Yeah. So, and I do think this walking thing, you could really capture it with a, you know, the PK, what would be PK 5. And then people understand that middle school concept. Parents could really maybe, and I don't know, but these are all the cool things we can do.
I think that the middle school concept is, yes, see you later, Jen. Thank you for joining. We'll send the go. I'll type these up and send them to you. And I gave you access to the
Pray for
document.
us.
I do think